August 14th, 1914. The sun rises over the desolate swamps of the Persian Gulf. British warships are already moving into position. Officially, Britain is not at war with the Ottoman Empire. That declaration won't come for another 3 months. But the ships are moving anyway. The history books will tell you this invasion was about protecting India. They'll tell you it was about stopping German expansion. They'll tell you it was about the Great War. They're lying. This wasn't a war, it was a corporate raid disguised in khaki uniforms. Britain didn't invade Iraq to fight Germany. Britain invaded Iraq because 6 weeks earlier, Winston Churchill had done something unprecedented. He had turned the British government into an oil company, and when governments become corporations, invasions become quarterly earnings reports. The British Empire in 1914 looked invincible from the outside. It covered 1/4 of the globe. The sun never set on its territory. London was the financial capital of the world. The pound sterling was backed by gold and accepted everywhere from Cape Town to Calcutta. British ships controlled every major sea lane. British banks financed every major government. British coal powered every industrial economy. If you looked at the balance sheet of the British Empire, you saw assets worth billions, factories, railways, colonies, gold reserves. But if you looked closer, you saw a crack in the foundation, and that crack was fuel. Britain's entire military and industrial machine ran on coal. Welsh coal, to be precise. It came from the valleys of South Wales. It was cheap, abundant, and most importantly, it was domestic. No foreign banker could cut off your coal supply. No enemy fleet could blockade your mines. As long as the world ran on coal, Britain was energy independent. That was the empire's hidden superpower, not the size of its navy, not the bravery of its soldiers. It was the fact that Britain controlled its own fuel source. Then technology betrayed them. By 1911, naval engineers had proven that oil was superior to coal in every way. Oil burned hotter, which meant faster ships. It burned cleaner, which meant you couldn't spot a fleet from 50 miles away by its smoke. And it was liquid, which meant you didn't need hundreds of men shoveling coal into furnaces during battle. You could refuel at sea. You could extend your range indefinitely. Tactically, oil was a revolution. Strategically, it was a nightmare. Because Britain had no oil, not a single drop in the Welsh valleys, not in the Scottish Highlands, not anywhere on the British Isles. Switching to oil meant Britain would have to import the lifeblood of its navy from foreign soil. It meant dependence. It meant vulnerability. It meant that for the first time in a century, Britain's survival would depend on keeping a supply line open to a place it didn't control. Winston Churchill understood this better than anyone. In 1911, he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. He was young, ambitious, and hungry for legacy. He looked at the German Navy and saw they were building faster ships. He knew Britain had to respond. So in 1912, he made the decision. The Royal Navy would switch from coal to oil. He ordered the construction of 5 new battleships. They were called the Queen Elizabeth class. They would be the fastest and most powerful warships ever built, and they would run exclusively on oil. Parliament was horrified. MPs stood up and asked the obvious question: where will the oil come from? Churchill's answer was chilling in its honesty. He said the only way to guarantee oil security was for the British government to become the owner of the oil at its source. Not a customer, not a partner. The owner. Think about what that means. Churchill was arguing that Britain needed to own the oil fields, not buy oil. Own the fields. That's not trade. That's colonization by another name. But where was the oil? In 1912, there were only 2 major oil regions in the world. One was Pennsylvania in the United States. America wasn't going to let Britain own that. The other was Baku in Russia. Russia wasn't going to allow foreign control either. But there was a third option, a gamble that had just paid off. In 1908, a British prospector named William Knox D'Arcy had struck oil in Persia. It was one of the largest oil discoveries in history. The field was in the mountains of western Persia, near a place called Masjid Suleiman. Darcy had spent 7 years and his entire fortune drilling in the desert. He had been days away from bankruptcy when the drill hit liquid gold. Black crude shot 50 feet into the air. Darcy formed a company to extract and sell the oil. He called it the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. By 1914, they had built a massive refinery on an island called Abadan. It sat right on the border between Persia and the Ottoman Empire. The refinery could process millions of barrels. But there was a problem. The company was private. It could sell to anyone. It could sell to Germany. It could go bankrupt. It could be bought out by American competitors like Standard Oil. Churchill saw the danger. He went to Parliament with a radical proposal. He wanted the British government to buy the company, not regulate it, not subsidize it, buy it outright. In the summer of 1914, just weeks before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Parliament approved the purchase. The British government bought 51% of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for £2 million. Let that sink in. The British government became the majority shareholder of an oil corporation. This had never been done before in British history. The state and the company merged. The profits of the company became the revenue of the Treasury. The security of the company became the responsibility of the British Army. When you drilled an Anglo-Persian well, you were drilling a government asset. When you threatened an Anglo-Persian pipeline, you were committing an act of war against Britain. This is the key to understanding everything that followed. The invasion of Iraq was not a military campaign, it was corporate asset protection. Now zoom out to the map. The oil was in Persia. The refinery was at Abadan. But the only way to get the oil out to the ocean was through a narrow waterway called the Shatt al-Arab. This river formed the border between Persia and the Ottoman Empire. On the eastern side was Persia. On the western side was the Ottoman province of Basra. The refinery sat right on this border. British engineers knew that geology doesn't respect political lines. If there was oil on the Persian side of the border, there was probably oil on the Ottoman side too. The provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul likely sat on top of the same underground ocean of crude, and the Ottoman Turks were starting to realize this. In 1912, a shadowy consortium called the Turkish Petroleum Company had been formed. It included German investors, British investors, and a mysterious Armenian middleman named Kalost Gulbenkian. Gulbenkian was known as Mr. 5%. He always kept a 5% stake in every deal. The company was preparing to drill in Mosul. If they found oil, the Ottoman Empire would control the northern fields. Britain would only control the southern exit point. Then the war broke out. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. The dominoes of alliance began to fall. Germany declared war on Russia. Germany invaded Belgium. Britain declared war on Germany. But the Ottoman Empire stayed neutral. They were watching and waiting. The British were terrified the Ottomans would side with Germany. If that happened, the Turks could shell the Abadan refinery from across the river. They could cut the pipeline. They could choke off the fuel supply of the Royal Navy just as the war began. Britain couldn't let that happen, so they made a preemptive move. On October 2, 1914, the British government sent a secret telegram to the Viceroy of India. The order was simple: prepare an invasion force. The target was the Persian Gulf. The mission was to secure the oil. This was 6 weeks before Britain declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Think about that. Britain was preparing to invade Ottoman territory while the Ottomans were still neutral. On November 5, 1914, Britain formally declared war on Turkey. The very next morning, British warships bombarded the Ottoman fort at Fao. This was the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab. Indian troops stormed ashore. They faced almost no resistance. The Ottoman garrison was weak and demoralized. Within days, the British controlled Basra. The refinery was safe. The pipeline was secure. Mission accomplished. This is where any rational military campaign would have stopped. You achieved the objective. You secured the asset. You dig in and defend. But oil has a way of making men greedy, and empires are rarely rational. The British started looking at the map again. They saw that Basra only controlled the exit. The oil fields themselves were further north. Geologists were whispering about the potential of Mosul. If Britain stopped at Basra, they only owned the gas station. If they marched north and took Mosul, they would own the oil field itself. The mission creep began. In 1915, the British sent an ambitious general named Charles Townshend up the Tigris River. Townshend didn't care about oil. He cared about glory. He wanted to be remembered like the heroes of history. He wanted medals and parades. But his personal ambition aligned perfectly with London's greed. Townshend captured the town of Amara. Then he took Kut al-Amara. Then he kept marching toward Baghdad. His supply lines stretched thinner and thinner. His men were dying of heat and disease. The Ottomans were retreating, but they were drawing the British deeper into the desert. It was a trap. In late 1915, Townshend reached a place called Ctesiphon, just 20 miles from Baghdad. There he met the main Ottoman army. The battle was a slaughter. Townshend lost a third of his force in a single day. He had to retreat. He fell back to Kut and dug in. The Ottomans surrounded him. The siege of Kut lasted 147 days. Inside the town, 13,000 British and Indian soldiers slowly starved. They ate the horses. They ate the mules. Then they ran out of animals. Disease ravaged the garrison. The British command tried to break the siege. They sent relief column after relief column. 23,000 men died trying to save the 13,000 inside. It was a disaster. On April 29, 1916, Townshend surrendered. It was the greatest humiliation in British military history. 13,000 men marched into captivity. Thousands of them died on the march to prison camps in Anatolia. Back in London, the government was in crisis. The press demanded answers. Why were British soldiers dying in a desert thousands of miles from the Western Front? The answer was the oil. But they couldn't say that. So they said it was about protecting India. They said it was about the prestige of the empire. But behind closed doors, the cabinet knew the truth. They had gambled on oil and lost. Now they had a choice: cut their losses and retreat, or double down. They doubled down. They sent a new general named Frederick Maude. They sent him with overwhelming force, heavy artillery, airplanes, and tens of thousands of fresh troops. Maude was methodical. He didn't rush. He recaptured Kut. Then, in March 1917, he marched into Baghdad. Once again, British officers read proclamations to the Iraqi people. They promised liberation from Ottoman tyranny. They promised freedom. But the real objective was always the same: control the oil. By 1918, the war in Europe was ending. Germany was collapsing. The Ottomans were suing for peace. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros. The war was officially over. All hostilities were supposed to cease immediately. At that exact moment, the British Army in Iraq was positioned south of Mosul. They had not captured the city yet. According to the terms of the armistice, Mosul was still Ottoman territory. The Turkish flag was still flying. The Ottoman garrison was still in command. But in London, the War Cabinet was looking at a geological survey. The report confirmed that Mosul sat on top of vast oil reserves. If the British stopped where they were, they would leave the richest oil fields in the Middle East in Turkish hands. So the British government did something brazen. They ordered General Marshall to keep marching. The war was over. But the British Army advanced anyway. They arrived at Mosul a few days after the peace treaty had been signed. The Ottoman commander protested furiously. He waved the text of the armistice. He said the British were violating international law. General Marshall ignored him. He said he had orders to occupy the city. The Ottomans had no choice. They withdrew. The British took Mosul. It was a heist. They had stolen an entire province after the final whistle. Now Britain controlled Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, the entire length of the oil pipeline from the mountains to the sea. But keeping it required more than soldiers. It required diplomacy. During the war, Britain had made a secret deal with France. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Two diplomats had carved up the Middle East on a map. In the original deal, Mosul had been assigned to the French zone. But now, Britain wanted it back. In December 1918, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George met with French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. They made a trade. Britain would give Syria to France. France would give Mosul to Britain. With a handshake, they decided the fate of millions. Syria went to the French. The oil went to the British. But now Britain had a new problem. How do you govern this place? The territories they had conquered were not a nation. They were 3 Ottoman provinces with nothing in common. Basra was Shiite and looked toward the Gulf. Baghdad was Sunni and cosmopolitan. Mosul was Kurdish and Turkoman. These people did not see themselves as one country, but Britain didn't care about identity. They cared about pipeline security. They needed one administrative unit that covered the oil fields in the north and the refinery in the south. So they invented a country. They called it Iraq. The name came from an old Arabic term, but it had never been a political state. Britain drew the borders not based on ethnicity or religion. They drew them based on the needs of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The Kurds were included because the oil was under their land. The Shiites were included because the ports were in their territory. These groups were forced into a shotgun marriage managed by London. The people didn't accept it quietly. In 1920, Iraq exploded in revolt. Shiite clerics issued fatwas. Tribal leaders took up arms. British garrisons were overrun. It was a full-scale uprising. The cost of suppressing the revolt was astronomical. The British Treasury was hemorrhaging money. Winston Churchill, now Secretary of State for War, needed a cheaper solution. His answer was brutal. He decided to police Iraq from the air. The Royal Air Force built massive bases at Habbaniyah and Shaiba. When a tribe rebelled, the RAF would fly over their villages and drop bombs. First they dropped leaflets, then they dropped explosives. They bombed homes, livestock, and people. It was terror from above, and it worked. The cost dropped. The revolt was crushed. The oil was safe. But Britain knew they couldn't rule directly forever. They needed a local face. They needed a puppet king. They found one in Prince Faisal. Faisal was the son of the Sharif of Mecca. He had fought with Lawrence of Arabia during the Arab Revolt. He had briefly been king of Syria until the French kicked him out. Now he was unemployed royalty. The British invited Faisal to Cairo. Winston Churchill and T.E. Lawrence sat him down. They offered him the throne of Iraq. There was one problem. Faisal had never been to Iraq. He didn't know the people. The people didn't know him. He was a foreigner. It didn't matter. The British put him on a ship and sent him to Basra. They staged a rigged referendum. 96% of the people supposedly voted for him. On August 23, 1921, Faisal was crowned king. The British designed the flag. They wrote the Constitution. But behind the throne, British advisors held the real power, and the oil stayed in British hands. In 1925, the Iraqi government signed the concession agreement with the Iraq Petroleum Company. It was a robbery in legal language. The company got exclusive drilling rights for 75 years. Iraq got a fixed royalty of 4 shillings per ton. No ownership, no profit sharing, just a tiny fee. Who owned the Iraq Petroleum Company? The British held nearly half. Shell had a chunk. The French got a piece for giving up Mosul, and the Americans eventually pushed their way in. Calouste Gulbenkian kept his 5%. He became one of the richest men in the world.